Welcome back to the Infill Insiders podcast, where we dissect specific state housing laws so that you know how to use them so that more infill housing that's denser can get permitted faster. And we're excited today to talk about the new CEQA exemption. So I'm really excited today. We have a great guest, Aaron Ekhouse. Aaron works at California YIMBY, which is deeply involved in getting these bills passed in the first place. Aaron, what's your title at California YIMBY?
I'm the Local and Regional Policy Program Director. Bit of a mouthful, but I do work with local government officials on making these laws a success at the local level, and then did a lot of policy work this past year on CEQA reform and transit-oriented development.
Excellent. And you've been at California YIMBY quite a while now, right?
I've been at California YIMBY for 8 years now. So I
Most of the history of
joined.
the organization. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's one bill that we did before my time, which was a significant bill, strengthening the Housing Accountability Act and sort of making that a real law. But every other bill we worked on, I've been there.
Well, thank you for that work. We really appreciate it, and we're still trying to understand it. So, but obviously
There's a lot this year.
Yes, a lot this year. So obviously we brought Aaron on because he worked on what we're going to talk about today, which is the new CEQA exemption specifically for infill housing development. And we're not going to get into the sausage making so much, the whole unusual process of this getting passed as part of the budget package, or why that happened. It's a mystery. That's fine. We want to look at what it is and talk about that. But because you were involved in the sausage making to some extent, you may be able to, since it's brand new, shed some light or why some of it's that way or puzzle at it with us. So specifically, this was in a bill that had the number AB 130, but that bill also had a bunch of other stuff. And most notably, a ton of the text of that bill was making permanent a whole bunch of stuff that's been passed in many housing bills over the last 5-7 years. So a lot of things that were going to sunset at 2030 or 2031 or 2035 or whatever now are permanent. Great. That doesn't really affect what you can do today or tomorrow or next year. So we're not going to focus on that. But if people are curious, look it up. I think it's a good moment to say, well, this is AB 130. Today, if you wanted to read the text of this bill, you can go up online and see one, AB 130. But in the future, I try not to do that. I try not to go back and look at the bill text unless I try to look at the law that the bill established or amended, because future bills will change. I'm sure on this topic, future bills will change it more. So you always want to look at what the current law is. And so this bill, among those other things it did, the thing we're talking about today is this new CEQA exemption, which really established a new section of state law 21080.66. And that is an exemption for certain infill housing. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're not going to go way into why, but, we'll say it's important to say, like, the whole reason this was a big deal in the state legislature is that especially in some areas of the state, a lot of infill housing that we would say is great for the environment to slower stop sprawl, put housing where people can walk and use active and mass transit, all that, and just fewer vehicle miles traveled, density, less infrastructure needed, all that stuff. So much of that housing gets at least threats of CEQA lawsuits and has added a lot of costs to do things to defend against those threats or prevent those from going to court. And I've seen, based in Santa Cruz, just using that, when I started being a housing developer, that was still a time when every multifamily project got threatened with a CEQA lawsuit, sometimes went to court, sometimes settled before that. But even those settlements, I would see them and they'd be like, the CEQA lawsuit was withdrawn because the project donated more money into the city's affordable housing fund. That's great. I don't know the environmental connection, right? Or upgraded a stoplight, which I don't see that either so much. Just encourages driving, or agreed to use union labor, which great thing. I support it, but it's not an environmental characteristic, right? So there's just it was so easy to use CEQA to delay and put pressure on, and then everybody could do that, and it's just part of the messy process, and then you had to build that in. Can you add anything to why now? Maybe you could answer, why did that get tackled this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the core concept that drove this is the idea infill housing is environmentally beneficial. So why do we have an environmental law blocking it? And I think that's a narrative that has been building for years legislatively. This moved fast this year because we had years and years of legislators coming to understand the nature of the problem. Two things that came to a head this year. There was a report from the Little Hoover Commission, which is an independent state body that does analysis on these issues and recommends to the legislature ways they can improve state law. And it identified a bunch of issues in CEQA, including a recommendation for an exemption for infill housing, what they call a clean exemption. We can maybe get into what makes it clean. Mostly clean, this one. And then Assemblymember Wicks, who this bill, the law passed in AB 130, but it was originally introduced AB 609 from Assemblymember Wicks, which we were co-sponsors of with the Bay Area Council. And she had done a lot of groundwork as well over the last year and a half with a select committee on permitting reform. And again, establishing with her colleagues this idea about, we have all of these processes that are delaying the approval of things that we need: infill housing, clean energy, good infrastructure, and CEQA being a part of that. And so I think that sort of created the conditions for something that, a few years ago still seemed kind of impossible.
Right. And I think we should say, CEQA does a lot of good as well, and, creates a program of studying what big environmental effects there are going to be and what can or should be mitigated or what shouldn't be done, et cetera. It's the details of, it certainly is a problem that it often gets applied much more strictly to this infill housing, even on small previously developed lots, all that kind of thing, and less in many ways, I would argue, gets applied less in many kinds of sprawl, and there's some real change fine tuning to do there. It's super exciting to us because we really focus, our work focuses on the infill housing, near jobs, near transit, walkable neighborhoods, all those things, and in places that have historically been challenging for creating that. Let's dive into it. Also, I should mention too, so there's not confusion. There's a whole other sort of CEQA exemption passed at the same time, Senate Bill 131, and it's more complicated and in some ways more controversial, probably more likely to get changed next year or something like that, and not as focused on houses. We're not talking about that. Yeah, and there are elements of that bill though that apply to housing. We'll come back another time because it's too much for one conversation here. But I just want to mention it because it's more of the context that can get confusing. Here we are. My understanding of that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding of what was intended by that adjective is the idea that it's pretty much a checkbox, set of checkboxes, that if you have a project and a site, you should be able to definitively figure out, does that project and site get this exemption? Does it qualify for it or does it not? And then move on. And if it doesn't, you go through the normal CEQA process that existed before. If it does, this exemption works and you move forward and you have it. And CEQA, then you are exempt from CEQA. It doesn't apply other than verifying that you qualify. That's what the clean exemption means, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the checkbox aspect of it, I think, is really important. There are existing exemptions, the categorical exemptions that they require basically a mini EIR to determine whether you even qualify. So with this, we wanted something where it would really be straightforward. The other thing I guess about clean is minimal non-environmental conditions as well, right? Where it's really, as much as possible, it's about what are the factors that will determine whether this is an environmental impact or not. Let's evaluate those. And to what degree can we reduce the use of pretextual planning in California, which it shows up in CEQA, it shows up in zoning. The whole fight about this with parking reform. Just make it as straightforward to use as possible and apply to as broad a set of infill housing as possible.
We know that this exemption works, at least some of the time, because this went into effect, I think, July 1st with the passage of the budget and everything. Yeah. Within a couple of weeks after that, we got a determination on a project using this exemption. So we just happened to have a project It just happened to be right at the right stage. We'd already done all the homework, the studies, whatever was needed. We knew all this information. We only heard that this exemption was coming last minute, right? Because normally things go into effect in January 1st, but this came out through the budget to come effect immediately. But as soon as we knew that, we notified Santa Cruz County. We said, look, we think it's a fit, boom, boom. Yep. And it was clean enough, especially in that case, in that site, that it wasn't hard to verify. Boom, got it, move forward. I'd have to say that was a project that, again, you'd have to say the odds here is it was going to get a threat of a CEQA lawsuit. So that was just right, boom, an infill apartment building moved a big step forward because of this. So that's great. We've had another project where there's been some fuzziness and hard to figure out if it fits this, and we think we might be there, but it's hard to figure out. So we'll get to that. Now let's get into what actually gets exempt from CEQA here. So there's a few categories of things that have to be checked off. One is some initial things about, location of the site, basically the definition of infill. So it doesn't say this. It's not what the statute says, but essentially it's defining what is infill for the purposes of this exemption. So one thing is the site has to be under 20 acres. And I do really think it's important for folks listening to this that want to use this to understand site does not mean parcel. Most often it is. You have a parcel and that's your project is that parcel, but the CEQA does not require that. Certainly sometimes you have multiple parcels, and eventually if your project's going to go forward, you might be combining them into one parcel, but you don't have to do that yet. You can apply for your project and that's your site is, these parcels. Or another situation, which we have done as well, you have a bigger parcel, you're just going to develop part of it. Maybe once it's entitled, you're going to split the parcel, maybe not, but you can define your site as an area within a parcel as well. And that gets important for figuring some of this out. It's not what we usually do, but you can do it. So anyway, your actual site of your project's got to be under 20 acres. That's pretty big for infill up to that. Most of them will be way smaller than that. But sometimes the 5-acre limit was a problem. So, you can go a bit more than that.
I think we were thinking in particular about like old malls as some of these like really good quality infill sites that are often larger than 5 acres.
Capitola Mall is being worked on in our neck of the woods. Yeah, maybe someday it'll be 1,000 units of housing. So then within a city, so an incorporated municipality, or within an urban area, which is defined by the Census Bureau, which can get adjusted. I assume it's every 10 years with the census, but but generally doesn't. It's about areas that are relatively densely developed, and it's just an algorithm. So there's nothing that's not a political boundary. It's an algorithm that comes up with it. Here's an urban area that's unincorporated, so that gets federally designated. This is definitely a very clean thing. You're either in a city or you're not. You're in a federal map of an urban area or you're not. Done. And that makes sense. You have to at least be that to be potentially infill. And then we get into more complicated stuff. It used to only, like the categorical exemption, it was this 75% surrounded by urban uses. So we'll pick that up a little bit. But this added a new big one, which would be the first thing people always look at on this. So you're under 20 acres, you're in a city or an urban area, then this thing has your site been previously developed with an urban use? And if it has, good, we're done with it. It's infill and can move on to other parts of how you qualify for this exemption. Has it previously been developed? And this is kind of a new thing in CEQA exemption. It's a great one, given that we're restricted to being in the city or urban area. What is an urban use? That also has been adjusted a little bit here. So it used to be just residential use, commercial, public institutional, retail, or transit uses. That's all great. Sometimes we'd run into things missing a little bit from that list. Now, urban use means it could be that previously, and that matters for other parts of this qualification for this exemption. But, if something had been built out as a commercial use and then now it's vacant, or even the office building was taken down, it could still be paved over, like that still counts as it has been developed. So it's still an urban use. Also a public park, that's more matters if you're next to it than if you're probably not developing a public park. But also a parking lot or structure that was added. So it's like, yeah, it makes sense. If the whole thing's paved over in a parking lot, that might arguably sometimes wasn't included as an urban use before. Now it is. Okay. So you got, or combinations of these things. So if your site is that or was that in the past, you're done in terms of being infill. I do have a little bit of question on these sites can be fairly big. What does it mean to be developed or previously developed? It doesn't really specify. Like, could you literally have like a 19-acre spot, a place, and one corner of it has a little old single family home or something? And then is the 19-acre thing developed or previously developed?
Yeah. I mean, that's something I think is going to get worked out in practice. There's always edge cases. We wanted to move this toward, like the history of CEQA has been a lot of things where when in doubt, it went toward restriction. And so for infill housing, I think we're reaching a point where the legislature is feeling more when in doubt, let's allow housing. Especially, we're talking about like the layers of requirements for this. So, we talked about has to be in the urbanized area or in the city. We'll get into the zoning consistency requirements. So whatever is being built there, it has to be zoned for it. It'll be interesting to see, I think, if we find some of those edge cases. One of the things I appreciate about working in policy with the California legislature is that they do legislate. So they will come back and clean up issues as they arise. And it's actually really helpful. You contrast to Congress, right? Where I think an issue like this, if there were issues, who knows?
No, it's like what counts as charitable housing under IRS law. It's like it totally doesn't make sense, but we're stuck with it for decades. And all that kind of stuff that's federal.
I mean, you can try to sneak it through like an omnibus, right? If you
right.
if you happen to find the right person to do that for you. But yeah,
very hard. Yeah.
So I think it'll be worth watching, like how this gets implemented, if there are edge cases that need cleanup. But I do feel pretty confident that the legislature will be willing to come look at these issues.
Yeah, and I can say we had a site that was, I don't remember, maybe 2.4 acres, if I remember correctly. And, a portion of it was the parking lot. And other parts of it, of that site, had never been developed, So, arguably this was intended to be like, then, yeah, that should count as infill, but I'm not completely sure. It doesn't just have to come back to the legislature. There's short of that, HCD will come out with guidance on this, and that's not as powerful under the law, or if it's something somebody want to challenge something in court, as if the legislature clarified it. But it can be really helpful if HCD comes out and guidance and say, well, and from the totality of their understanding of housing law and case law and other things, and CEQA is the thing. I can't pretend to know what all the CEQA stuff that's been litigated in the past. There may be an answer to this from something, and so they'll come out in the next year with guidance that says, and they may clarify this, they may not, but hopefully they will.
Yeah.
So
we'll move on. LCI as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think CEQA stuff may come from LCI, but I think actually, SB 131 told LCI, hey, like more CEQA guidance, please.
Yes, absolutely. So, okay. So hopefully folks can look and say, oh, my site is developed and I'm redeveloping it, or was previously developed and I'm redeveloping it, done. But if that's not the case, I'll try to go quick here. There's a few other tests, even if your site has never been developed, or you can't say that it's been developed. Maybe it was even developed for light industrial and then rezoned for residential. That wouldn't count as having been previously developed as an urban use here. Things like that. There's going to be other cases. And we have worked on parcels very much infill in the middle of a pretty good sized city that we don't think that parcel was actually even ever developed. 100 years ago it was part of a farm, and now all the rest of that is densely developed, and this one part is still sitting there. So that happens. But so you can have a parcel, or a site, I should say, a site that's 75% surrounded, the traditional thing, by urban uses. So it's next to things that all qualify as urban uses. 75% of the perimeter is adjacent to that, across the street or whatever. So that's great. But there's some new things, also things that I didn't know that previously developed will get added in. I've been bugging people for years to say, most parcels are rectangles, and if it's the long side that's next to a vacant parcel, or next to something, or even light industrial, but it's still okay to develop, or whatever, it's something that doesn't qualify as an urban use. Can we still be infill? And so that was added, that if 2/3 of your if your site is four-sided and at least 2/3 of it's adjacent to an urban use, and 3 of those 4 sides are all adjacent to the urban use, then you can qualify, even if you're a little short of 75%. So just some flexibility, and we've definitely seen parcels and cases that would have needed that in the past, although they may qualify as previously developed. And then, this is a belt and suspenders. And I know this kind of thing gets happened because in the sausage making, you don't know what's going to make it through the whole legislative process and come out the other side, right? So I do appreciate that, like, multiple things were put in here. And then the last one put in, is that even if you fail all this other stuff, if you're perhaps not previously developed for an urban use, qualifying urban use parcel, if it's in a place where 75% of things within a quarter mile of it are urban uses, then it still qualifies. And I'd advocated for something like that a few years ago. I actually would really caution people on using this unless it gets cleaned up, or banking on it, because I think it's fairly challenging the way it's written, as you could really get in a tangle. We would, I think, get in a tangle with local government if you were anywhere remotely close to the 75% limit, because, and there's, a few issues. The whole, what does the radius mean exactly? I assume it means all the area within a quarter mile of any part of your parcel. I would have written that differently because that's not exactly what a radius is, but that probably is clear enough. But it also says
I would assume that, like, the radius being a feature of a circle, right? So we're sort of, the radius defines a circle.
Yes, but this won't be a circle because your parcel is not a point.
Yes. Okay.
You'll have some straight lines adjoined by arcs in that quarter mile shape, but it's not a circle, So, but I think it's metaphorically kind of similar. So, but then also it says is developed with urban use, which might negate the fact that urban use includes previously developed with urban uses sites. So if you have, so like that was sort of added in. So is that meant to be more restrictive than the definition? I think that's just confusing. So then can you include vacant lots that were previously developed in your 75% or not? I think that's at least arguable. Does the site itself count towards your 75% or not? And if you had a big, a quarter mile by a quarter mile squares is only 40 acres. So if you got a 19-acre site and then you include a quarter mile around that, a bunch of the area is the site. Does that count toward it or not in the numerator or the denominator? It's just a question. And if you're on the edge, you could see cases that are fit one way and don't the other. And then you get an argument about it because we're in that situation all the time. But then the biggest thing is, what does area is developed with urban uses mean? Because it's not talking about parcels. It's talking about within this shape, how much of that area is developed. And you're not talking projects anymore or project sites. So if you have a single family home parcel, does only the footprint of the house count and not the yard? Okay, that's maybe a small case where, say, oh, you're being unreasonable. Back to my 2.4 acre site where half acre of it was parking lot, and the rest hadn't been developed. Well, if that's one of the parcels in your surrounding area, we can say, well, that most of that site is not area that has been developed with urban use, right? So I think that wording is fairly problematic. I think if someone came to me saying, I got 79%, I'm like, I bet I can poke holes in that. So we don't need to dig into it more than that, but you get the point where it's like, I'd like that to be, I don't feel that is clean. On the other hand, it's like your fourth option for being infill here. So I'm not too worried about it because it would be, I think, pretty rare that you get through. You can't do the first 3.
Yeah. I'll say, I do think a lot of these are things that could probably be resolved through guidance, right? Like this question of, so like, what does area mean? I mean, I would interpret it as parcels proportionate to area, right? So if you have a parcel that's developed and another parcel that's not, and one of them's twice as big as the other, then it's, 1/3 or 2/3, right? But that's all kind of stuff that could be specified in guidance. Every time there's friction, I think it's worth documenting because that's grist for the mill of either guidance or clarification.
Exactly. Yeah. So it'll be, if there's anything surprising in that guidance that comes out, we'll come back and talk about it. here so that people know to follow it. Hopefully it's just like, oh, it's all common sense. It didn't make sense. But sometimes there's some real, I don't mean it's going in left field, but it's just like important clarifications that you really want to follow that wouldn't have been totally obvious. So, and then, I mentioned those, changes. So, if you're trying to do, you're surrounded by like 75% surrounded. Now you can be adjacent to a city park as long as that city park is itself surrounded by urban uses. So you got a little bit to fall through, but the definition of urban use has been improved, in my view, to be more of the things that get run into. So it's pretty great. You do have to watch out if you're at the edge of a residential or commercial zone and you're running up against light industrial zone or something like that. You got to pay attention to see if you really still qualify. Cool. So that's all that infill stuff. Then there's things that have been used in quite a few laws before, so are not so new. You have to be consistent with zoning or general plan, but you get to use state laws like density bonus law in how you're consistent, right? So you could use bonus height if you're qualifying for density bonus law, waivers and concessions, that kind of stuff. So within that context of how things are modified or joined with state law, you got to fit in. So if the general plan designation doesn't allow any commercial or residential use, then you probably can't build housing there to begin with. So that's good and appropriate. The second item on here, though, is you have to be consistent with the local coastal program. We haven't yet succeeded at passing a law that says you can definitely use density bonus law in the coastal zone. Like if local ordinances, say the height limit in the local ordinance zone is also in the local coastal plan, you can't necessarily use density bonus law to go above that height.
Yes.
It's a lot more, restrictive here. And so that's a different issue that needs to be solved, in my view. But certainly here, this specified you have to be consistent with the local coastal plan, and that can't yet automatically get modified. Doesn't mean you can't sometimes get density bonus height or waivers or whatever approved in the coastal zone, but it's a lot riskier and harder.
I mean, I think this is one where, and I think you're right. Like, this is something where I think we are at an earlier stage of the process that I talked about at the beginning that led to CEQA reform being ripe this year, on housing in the coastal zone. And I think it's a little trickier. The policies of it are just a little trickier because the concentrated cost diffuse benefit calculus gets flipped a little, and it's just concentrated cost and concentrated benefit. But I think, there's work to be done on housing in the coastal zone. This will
when
be
you
part
say
of it.
that, you mean politically it's the smaller areas that it affects.
Yeah.
So there's more concentrated defense to not change it, and that's where the change happens. And we've seen with housing policy in general, when you get down to more local level, it's much harder to change things to be more permissive on housing.
Yeah. Like you think about with the CEQA reform, there's groups that are really invested in CEQA, but then the potential housing that this affects is everywhere in the state, right? And this is something where even we talk sometimes with people who are like, oh, what are you doing about housing in rural areas? Because some of our legislation, SB 79 in the background, definitely an urban area bill. CEQA reform is rural, urban, suburban, all of it. The coastal zone stuff, it's a very small part of the state. And so there's these really strong interests on one side of it. And then a lot of the state it's less relevant for. So you don't have the same breadth of potential reformers. I still think it's important. The coast is a really important part of the state. There are places where the coastal zone is really big. So
I'm
I
sitting
just think
2
it's
blocks
more
from the
challenging.
coastal zone right now.
Yeah.
I'm in downtown
Yeah.
Santa Cruz, and 2 blocks away, there's no line on the sidewalk. It's still downtown Santa Cruz. You still can't see the ocean from here, but you cross a parcel boundary, not even a street. You don't even have to cross the street. You just
It's in the
cross the
middle
parcel
of
boundary, middle of a block.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's middle block. Okay.
Mid block. Oh, now you're in the coastal zone. So, on the one side of that line, you can use density bonus law easily, and the other side you can't. And I would argue, everything you said makes sense, and I guess the political reality. But we shouldn't spend too much time on this. But where it does matter, it is close to jobs. It is a very desirable place, right? So it has a little more relevance just than its acreage,
one of the most climate resilient parts of the state, right? Like, because of the resilience against extreme heat.
where it's
So I
back from the
definitely,
coast, ironically.
yeah, where it's not,
Yeah.
where you're not like on the bluff top,
On the,
right?
yeah, exactly.
But this is one of the things, right? It's like, I think the coastal zone, it's a place where like the political decisions of 50 years ago are still governing the state because that's how they drew the lines.
Yeah, very political boundary on how it was drawn, not an environmental boundary. I talked to people who were involved with drawing it, and they said it was 100% political. So, yeah. So, in any case, fine. That's just a caution for folks. Like, if you're in the coastal zone, examine this, and still may be a fit. You can use this exemption in the coastal zone. You just, can't if you're using some aspects of density bonus law, perhaps. Going to density, there's a minimum density requirement, and it's the Mullen densities, and it's half of that, so it's you got to look that up, but it's and so that's different depending on how big a city you're in, or unincorporated or incorporated, fine. But the point is, there's a minimum for any given spot in the state. There's a clear minimum density project, so you can't be taking a big site and just doing a few units and getting the exemption for that. I think that's great. Then we've got all the stuff that originally I think came from SB 35, unless it was previously copied from somewhere else. But all this stuff, and so quickly, you can't be in the appeal zone within the coastal zone. So that's the most sensitive area of the coastal zone that is more environmentally dictated, or in a place that doesn't have a local coastal program, or is subject to 5 feet sea level rise, or not zoned for multifamily housing in the coastal zone, et cetera. Other stuff, not prime ag land, and there are city boundaries that kind of end up including ag land in some places. So that's relevant. Site doesn't have wetlands, not in the very high fire severity zone unless certain, mitigation measures have been passed. I like how this was done in not a hazardous waste site unless the agencies have signed off on the cleanup, because that's been a problem, at some other statutes in the past have just said, oh, if you, and to be clear, this is not like a hazardous waste facility. This is just like, oh, somebody did auto work on the site for a number of years. The dry used to be a dry cleaner, whatever, all kinds of stuff, right? Car wash. And then, and so now it's on a list. And so no matter even if you completely cleaned up all of the toxic soil, you can't use these state laws. So that's not the case here. So that's good. Earthquake zone, floodway, other certain flood zones, conservation lands or conservation easement, not demoing any historical registered, historical buildings. And then, the one worth talking about a little bit more is that no habitat for protected species, and lots of different types of species of plants and animals in different categories, which is all fine. This one has already tripped up quite a few projects trying to use this exemption, because it's not significant habitat, or it doesn't matter if your project isn't going to have significant impacts on the habitat that happens to be on the site, or there's a lot of species for which there's really standard measures, if you got to check and not disturb them during construction. If the trees are staying there that are seasonal habitat for something, you can't build during that season, or there's a lot of standard stuff. But in this case, your site just can't have any habitat. You can get into having to check quite a few things at different times of year, and again, there are contexts in which that makes sense. You can be in a city and on the WUI and different things, but there's really like core infill areas. And literally heard someone the other day, a CEQA expert, talking about a site that had one tree. Literally, there was only one tree on the whole site, and so then you had to see, did migratory birds ever stop in that tree at a given time of year, because that one tree could be habitat. So there's not really any limits about significance or impacts to the habitat or whatever, and there probably is a little better balance. Again, it's an appropriate thing to have in here, like not running roughshod over significant habitat, but even in infill, otherwise qualifying infill locations. But this probably is a little more absolute. So we had somebody out at one of our projects last night looking for any evidence of an unlikely protected species of bat, because we learned recently that any old dilapidated buildings that would be easy to demo otherwise, if you're doing it for a project like this, you got to make sure these man-made structures, don't have a protected bat coming into them, kind of thing. So, even though, again, I'm not making light of disturbing protected species, except that, there are many species and cases where, it'd be easy to deal with, without damaging the species. So I think that's one where, I would just caution anyone listening who's going to use this, like, pay attention early to that topic. Because it's easy to get a standard biotic study on a site that you'd be getting and have it say, well, this could be habitat here, could be habitat there, but didn't, like, really rule out the presence of a species. And then you could get caught later, like, oh, you got to go back and study that and stuff. So it's something to get on early, especially as currently written.
Yeah, I mean, good flag for practitioners, and I think this is something that, as far as the standard from SB 35 8 years ago, it's one of those things that maybe seemed more straightforward when it was drafted than it's proven to be in practice. Like you said, habitat is a very broad term. Protected species is a very broad class. I think this is something that probably warrants a little more refinement. Challenging though, that list was really heavily negotiated. So
I wouldn't touch what species are on the list, right? I agree. Like, but
I'm saying like
besides the fact it's not my
the SB
expertise,
35
but
list.
yeah,
Like the
yeah,
list,
yeah,
the list
yeah,
of the list of
totally.
environmental exclusion conditions. And
Oh, I
it
see
gets
this whole
cited
list.
in,
Yeah.
yeah, and it gets cited in like a dozen at least other bodies of law. Like it's one of those things that, once a deal is made, it's always easier to just go back to that deal than it is to try to negotiate more. But yeah, I think, especially like thinking about, we talked at the beginning, right? We want people to be able to know, like have confidence going in whether or not they're going to be eligible for this. And so that's something where I think there could be improvement on the habitat
Yeah.
piece.
Because it can be hard to prove a negative, right?
Yeah.
And so it's, having some clear standard somehow that you definitely have to hit, that isn't 100% proving a negative would be ideal. The last one I wanted to ask you about, I was surprised to sort of randomly see in this last thing you can't do is have any hotel or bed and breakfast or Airbnb type use. Doesn't call it Airbnb, obviously, but that type of use in your project. Now, to be a housing development project, you got to mostly be, long-term housing that you're renting out, housing units, but projects can be mixed use and use this. You could have 10% of your square footage, 20% of your square footage, whatever it be, ground floor retail. In fact, cities really, really love that in a lot of contexts, even when you, as a developer, don't want to do that because you're afraid it's going to sit vacant for 10 years, So there's a lot of, but, urban fabric, there's a lot of good ways to do mixed use, but you can't have your mixed use be a hotel and be in it. And this as a true, about environmental factors. Where did that come from?
So why can't we have hotels as part of these mixed use housing developments? I mean, it's a purely political thing. This was something that Unite Here, the Hotel Workers Union, has made a priority through a number of state housing laws over the last couple of years, and they made a really concerted push this year. And I won't comment
Sure.
too much on what's driving them there, but that's been a big priority of theirs. And you'll see it in a few of the other housing laws that passed this year, is that they don't want this type of streamlining applied to hotels.
Okay, I get it now. Yeah, it's not about not having hotels in these housing projects. It's about there's a political constituency wanting to make sure they're not exempt from CEQA, probably so they can apply pressure in certain cases to affect those projects through the use of CEQA. Got it. Okay, so there's, I'm thrilled that there is the political interest and will to get over that hump for infill housing, because that's what we really need. As far as I'm aware, we don't have a hotel supply crisis. to the same extent. So fine. Then, okay, you do all this stuff, you figure out if you qualify. Then we've got things on the requirements and process that come with this. The one thing on process added in that's now getting in a lot of housing bills is the tribal notification. And we talked about that a little bit in our last episode on SB 330 pre-applications. The thing I would highlight on this, I mean, it's great. Notify the tribe, see if they want to consult, see if they have input on this particular location, etc. If I'm developing, I wouldn't leave it just to this process, because this fine, it says that the local jurisdiction has to start that within 14 days of deeming the project complete. I'd say the challenges we run into is a lot of local jurisdictions don't know that. So the minimum, you got to tell them, look, you're required to get this started. We want you to get this started. And you want them to get it started because it's required to do it. And it can take as long as around 150 days or so if they do want to, if a tribe does want to consult and everybody takes the maximum time to get back to each other and all that stuff, it can take a long time. It's a reasonable process, but you just want to get it started soon. The other thing is, like, that 14 days after you get completeness, you don't know, they certainly haven't made a determination if you get this exemption or not yet. And this exemption is what required that. So it's really like a requirement that comes with an exemption that hasn't been determined yet. And you may not have even done all the studies or turned everything in, because a lot of cases where you can get your housing development application complete, you don't need everything you need for a CEQA determination to get completeness on your housing application. And so you both want to have the conversation with the local jurisdiction as early as possible. What do you think I need for this determination? Is even as clean as it is, again, there can be things that, you're in the area for butterflies and you didn't know that, you got to study the butterflies. So you want to have that conversation as soon as possible. But also, we would just say, it's fine that this is in here, but just submit a pre-application earlier and tell the jurisdiction when you do the pre-app that you want them to start the tribal notification. So I would get it started even earlier than this and do it triggered, and you're allowed to trigger it off of a pre-app. You can't always tell a jurisdiction, do a tribal notification within 14 days. They don't have to follow that. They do, here, but they do at a pre-app if you request that. So I would get it started then. And then you got to do a phase one. I asked you that question. Why lenders all require phase ones and stuff? And is there some constituency that wanted to make sure the small percentage of projects that don't already do a phase one get one done?
This is something that I think you see that stuff gets into one bill and then it moves forward into future bills. So I think this was from AB 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And then same author. I don't actually know if there was someone particular asking her for this. Like, I could speculate that it was environmental justice groups, but I don't actually know that. So it's but I think it's trying to find a balance of reassuring people we're not like skipping over identifying environmental toxins and hazards here. I think people have this idea of CEQA exists to protect people from those things, and maybe or maybe not actually. CEQA is really more about the impacts of the project on the environment than it is about environmental hazards facing the project. Right. That's a idea people have about CEQA that feels important. So I think that part of that is just trying to be reassuring. And then my sense, and based on what you're saying, right, is this is something that a project would almost certainly have to do anyway, right?
Yeah.
So to that extent,
multiple parties in the project don't want to do a project and find out later people are living above some even modest amount of contamination that could be evaporating up into the building. Complete disaster. Everybody loses. Certainly the people who live in the housing lose, but everybody else loses as well. So, lenders always require it, but that's later in the stage. But if as a developer, you have any sense that there's any chance that your site or a neighboring site has had uses that typically cause some contamination or make then you're going to do it early on just to make sure, because if there is something, then you got to do a phase two. And then if phase two identifies contamination, then you got to clean it up, and you don't want to find that out late in your project. So we don't always do a phase one. There's plenty of cases where we're just really confident, nobody's. And, but we know we're going to do one eventually anyway for financing, so that the lender's comfortable, but often we do one right on. So yeah, I was just kind of curious about that.
Actually, I'm curious about this. What's about the cost for the phase one.
Phase one, yeah, it's just a desk study, meaning folks are just looking in databases at past records of anything that happened within certain distance of the site and on the site, and photographic surveys to see if, even if there's no record in any other database, if there's a picture of a gas station that was there at one point, or, all kinds of things. So it's a few $1,000s,
Okay.
Like everything, prices go up, but, maybe you spend $4,000 on it. But, definitely worth doing. Then we get into some also, a question I had for you. It's like the prevailing wage and other labor requirements. If you're over 85 feet, then some labor requirements kick in. One thing we really hope is clarified in guidance is, what is this 85 feet? Because there are places, is it as defined by the building code, which would usually be up to like the parapets on the roof, but there's other cases where, your elevator shaft height, or you putting some antenna on top of the building also counts. And then this is silent on that. And there are, different parts of laws, codes, ordinances that calculate heights a little differently. And if you are doing 7 stories, 8 stories, even 7 stories with an elevator thing on the top or whatever, you want to not get tripped up. You want to know, and ideally, I think it's kind of meant to be like, if you can build it with mostly wood frame, then that isn't triggered. Yeah. And if you can't, because it's taller than that, even if it's mass timber, it's a different building type, okay, then we're requiring that. But that's not exactly what it is. It's actually a height, and that.
Yeah. Well, you can't exactly say in the law, right? Like, oh, this is built with this construction type or that construction type.
I don't know. Why not? I mean, they're saying height, right? This isn't an environmental thing, and it's not. You could say this construction type. I mean, maybe there's a reason you can't, but it doesn't seem any less arbitrary to me. But then the other thing is, if you're 100% lower income affordable housing, then you're prevailing wage. And I have already heard someone talk about a project that was 100% lower income and not using LIHTC. And so is opting out of using this exemption to not be locked in from the beginning to prevailing wage, even though, always love to pay people more. It's just a challenge because everything's a challenge with cost, and wish we didn't have to pay other things and could spend that money on paying wages, it wouldn't be my first pick. But in any case, it seems like trying to leverage like that relatively small amount of affordable housing projects that aren't using public funding sources that already require prevailing wage, and making sure they also do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it. One of the biggest challenges for CEQA reform over many years has been the labor politics. And I think that's what this is about, is, and the labor politics around this bill, you may recall, listeners may recall, got really, really heated when it moved into the budget. We had comparisons to Jim Crow. We had, lobbyists saying that we were putting workers in chain gangs, like really overheated stuff. So this was part of the deal that got worked out there, just to address some of the priorities from organized labor, construction labor groups. And I think, I know, I think you do some non-LIHTC, 100% affordable housing development. And that was part of what got caught up in it.
Yeah. I mean, the weird quirk is, like in our case, when we do that, it's not necessarily all affordable housing under an affordable housing agreement with the local jurisdiction. It may be in an agreement with, the church that owns the land, or impact investment source or something like that, right? So then this wouldn't get triggered. I mean, it's all, it's unfortunate when all this hoops and details that aren't in anything to do with the environment, get into this, but that's politics. And this has less of that than a lot of housing bills, I would say. So, well, cool. That's what it is. Anything you think we missed, or anything you've heard about people using it?
No, but I love with this one that, because it was in the budget and went into effect so quickly, we're able to get like these immediate stories of people being able to use it is really encouraging. The whole point of like the work to pass these laws is for them to get used to build housing. So it's really great that that's already happening, and yeah, hopefully a lot more. Quicker, faster, easier to build, infill housing. That's
right.
what we hope is going to be.
Awesome. So hopefully this answered a lot of people's questions or helped gave them an introduction. They can dig into it more where they need to. So we're just going to wrap up the podcast episode with a couple things. First of all, when we go through a lot like this, we like to step back now and say, in all these challenges of developing housing, solving the housing crisis in California, how would you rank what this is trying to tackle, which was the challenge of CEQA for infill housing to the degree it shouldn't have been a challenge. Like, there's an appropriate role for CEQA, such as all these checklists, I would say. But to the where it was a problem, how big of a problem was that? Is this one of the most important things to tackle out of the last 10 years of housing bills, along with a few others? Or is it barely important all, or somewhere in between, like on a 1 to 5 scale? Where would you put it?
I put this as a 1 or a 2. I think this is a top tier challenge for housing in California. I'm curious your perspective.
Yeah, I think so too. I think I'm biased because of where I've worked within California, and my understanding is like the rate of getting threats of CEQA lawsuits varies dramatically across the state.
Yeah.
And there are local jurisdictions that are probably too permissive in making CEQA determinations. And I've, people I really respect that fight against that. But I've worked in jurisdictions where, it's the most nitpicky part of the process, and you never feel like you completely put it to bed, and you're worried about it. So yeah, at least it's not quite just the coastal zone, but at least in some big, very desirable areas of the state, but maybe not the whole state, I would say it's clearly a 1. And I think there's other places where it might be a 2 or a 3. So, but yeah, I agree with you. It's somewhere in that 1 to 2 overall. And just great to take a whole bunch of that for infill housing off the table. And I like how it also updated. It will have ripple effects, in my view, in this bill. It updated the urban uses just for this bill for now, but that'll probably perpetuate to other things. Okay, so this was a 1 or a 2.
I want to jump one on this. So I think one thing you allude to that like is so significant about this is like just the uncertainty that has been created around CEQA. So like the CEQA lawsuits are just the tip of the CEQA iceberg, right?
Absolutely.
Because like you talk about the way people defensively to do their projects to avoid CEQA challenges, and like we lose housing from that. The people who just don't want to bother investing in building housing in California because they're like, well, my money could be tied up for 5 years while somebody sues about, the fact that I'm casting a shadow on their zucchini garden.
Real story.
And so, yeah, the zucchini is real. The zucchini shadows that was a real thing. So yeah, I think that is going to have I think why we saw this as such a central thing is like we have to make it reliable. Like it doesn't have to always reliably be yes, but to know going in with as much certainty as we can give people.
Right. It shouldn't always be yes, right? Because there's always going to be a site, even in infill locations, that would damage the watershed or whatever it is, right? So yeah, absolutely. So that's great. Remove the chilling effect, of all of the uncertainty. So that big deal. How would we each grade how well this bill did at that?
I mean, I'm biased, obviously.
Give us the bias view.
I think this is a great bill. I think optimistically this will largely solve the challenge of CEQA for infill housing. We thought maybe it's a B plus because there's like a few things that can be improved, but also maybe I give it an A as a friendly grader.
Yeah, I was going to say A minus. So, and I feel like I'm a stickler on these things because, so I give it an A minus, which is pretty high mark in my view from me, because I think, yes, this is like so far from where we were a year ago. I think, yeah, there's a few things that probably need to be tightened up. My number one thing would be the habitat. Then there's a few political things in there that aren't ideal, but I wouldn't knock it down from an A to an A- just because of those, because you always got that to some extent. But I think as far as just its usability reliably, I think it's very close, and hopefully guidance will improve it. And then maybe a couple things will end up getting changed over time. So yeah, I think an A-. So that wraps us up on the CEQA investment, the CEQA exemption. And so our last question of the show, because especially great for you, because you think forward like this, you're done with this. I'm just starting the journey with this CEQA exemption. You're done with it, unless we get to improve it. But it's this kind of a what's coming next. But it's also like, what's your dream? Like, what is one idea that you wish California would successfully tackle with housing law?
I'll start thematically. I think what we're looking at for next year is cost reduction. Like, what can we do to bring down the cost to build housing in California? Because I think, we've made so much progress on permitting. We've made, especially this year, so much progress on zoning. And if it costs $1 million a unit, it's like that progress is not going to deliver the outcome. So big picture cost, I think we're looking at how can we bring down impact fees. We're looking at how can we bring down financing costs. How can we bring down construction costs. I would love to see like a reform to even just like the process for the building code in California, and like have this. I think people assume the building code is a government document. Most people, maybe not listeners of this podcast, it's like largely created by private parties. They're largely not that concerned with construction cost when they do it. I think that's like the state taking a more active role there could be long-term really powerful.
Great. Completely agree. I go around all the time and say, now the housing we need in California is actually legal to build. It's just too expensive to build. So we're not getting it yet. That's literally my top sentence about where we're at and turn this ship around. So that's really exciting. Exciting and everything that's been accomplished, and exciting we're looking at that general topic next. So thank you. And when you get it done, we'll come back here and talk about it. All right. Thanks, Aaron.
That's another long-term project. I think it took us 8 years to do CEQA. So yeah, maybe 8 more years.
8 more years to cut the cost per unit in half. That'd be great. Inflation adjusted even, we'd take it. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.